Okay, I'm Will Lewis. I was born in Oxford in 1936, and I've been more or less a resident for since, this being the year 2023. I'm about to talk about a local legend, one that I heard about in my youth and has always been in my mind. And it's pretty much a common knowledge then. It was common knowledge then, but now it's pretty much forgotten. So I think it's important that I record this story. It's about the Wohlleben family saga, I call it. And I think, I don't know whether blacksmiths could have a saga or not, but the Brits do, so why not Oxford people? Just in short, I would summarize by saying it's largely rumored, and I believe the rumor that this blacksmith who immigrated to Mississippi, to Oxford, was a member of a Confederate unit, a cavalry unit that participated in the raid of General Van Dorn in Holly Springs. And he is rumored, and it's written in contemporary accounts, that the money was lost, and that one, at least, account says that he departed with it. And Mr. Faulkner writes that about, tells the legend in some of his writings several different ways. But that's the legend. Now, it could just stop there, except that there's ample circumstantial evidence that Mr. Wohlleben came back to Oxford and invested a great deal of this money in town, and I consider him a builder of the town for that reason, and a good man, although it may be some things about him that I don't know. He also invested elsewhere, as we shall see, and increased his income considerably, and I should say probably increased the income of his sons-in-law, his daughters, and another couple of generations after that, which is an interesting story. So let's get into it, if we choose. The man's name was Henry Herman Wohlleben. He was born in 1837 and died in Oxford in 1904. He was born in Bavaria, or Saxony, in Germany in 1837. He, as a young man, immigrated to America, and first port of entry for him was Baltimore. But apparently he moved on to Illinois soon thereafter, where he married Katrina Schmidt, who also was born in Bavaria, and perhaps they knew each other, but that's lost to history now. At any rate, he went for a bit of time in Ohio, and he married, and he had a couple of his daughters, or they had a couple of daughters there. But by the late 1850s, he came to Oxford and set up a blacksmith shop. He first was in a rental situation in what is now the area that the Harrison condominiums are located in. Location remained in his hands for a great many years, and until very recent history, it was still a blacksmith shop.
Each morning, Marion Randolph Hall opens the business, which he has operated in Oxford since 1930. His shop is located just 2 blocks from the Court Square in a densely wooded area. On this site stands one of the oldest oak trees in the county. Despite his 88 years, he moves easily up the hill to unlock the doors of a dusty shed which housed the tools and equipment of his trade. Mr. Hall is one of only a few hundred practicing and active blacksmiths in America today. His services are unique and varied. He'll shoe your horse, repair your broken axe handle, sharpen your blades, and create from iron most anything a customer requires. Mr. Hall is above all an artist. His pride and joy are his knives, which he has designed and executed so beautifully. For a closer look at the world of Mr. Hall, let's join him at the forge. We're at the forge with my friend Mr. Hall, who has been in the business, he tells me, since 1930.
I've been here since 1930. I've been in the business since 1910 working for the public.
Okay, before we get into this next slide, though, I want to make the point that the inquiring reporter in this case is my wife, Patty Paval Lewis, and she is, I think the year it was made is 1971. She was taking a course on the campus in whatever this is called, broadcast journalism or something, just as a lark, and she made several of these films, class project. I'm sorry we don't have them all, but let's go on. This brings us to the Civil War. Everything in Oxford history has to revolve around the Civil War. Once I had a young lady from Eastern University, it's been a while ago, come, and somebody directed her to me to talk about the history of Oxford. But she said, I have to leave the Civil War out. That maybe it was, controversial to her instructor, or maybe to her, and so that's not hard. That's not easy to do. But I found something to talk about, I guess, and at any rate, it's like Faulkner said, the past is with us at all times. So, in December of 1862, General Grant conceived what he called the Mississippi Central Railroad Campaign. It was his intention to go down the railroad, which ran from Grand Junction, Tennessee, to Grenada, and then on to Jackson, and then on to South Mississippi. He was going to go down the railroad and capture Vicksburg. But as we will see, it didn't work out. To go by that route, they had to go by river, and it took a great effort and a lot of time for them to eventually capture Vicksburg. But that was Grant's campaign, and he was in Oxford to direct it. He set up shop right across the street from where I am today, in the office of the Digital Museum, and on a high lot that looked down and could see the depot. And that was his intention, to be able to look and see what went on down there, and units going back and forth. The railroad at that time was about 10 years old, and it was the main method of transportation between Oxford and anywhere else. Roads were almost non-existent. But at any rate, that's where he set up, and Ms. Grant was here. There are a great many other Union generals and their troops here. It said, and I really doubt some of this, it said that Sherman was here at College Hill with 30,000 troops. I think that's got to be an exaggeration, but there's probably a lot of exaggerations concerning the Civil War. He was here, and College Hill couldn't stand 30,000 troops, I know, but I know they were strung out between there and the river north, and the town of Abbeville, which also was later burned. But at any rate, there were generals north of Oxford set up to repel rebels, and south of Oxford around the Yocney River, or Yocney-Patawpha River, as it's properly known. Oxford was the seat of a lot of things in the war. It seems like Oxford is always coming to the front in anything that gets in the newspaper. But there's Grant. Now, meanwhile, Wohlleben has joined the Confederate Army, the 1st Mississippi Cavalry Regiment. He's in Company B, which was named for Jacob Thompson, and it was raised up in this county. That is, the people and their horses came from Lafayette County, and that was the thing. You brought your own horse. And I'm sure that he was very valuable in shoeing all those horses, but he really had, as I've learned, really a pretty important role with this cavalry unit. At any rate, they joined the expedition of General Van Dorn, which had an intention. There is. My son added the note that he did not die in battle, which is true. He was pretty much of a reprobate and was killed by a jealous husband not long after the events that he's famous for. Also, he's not a very good citizen. He got court-martialed by the Confederate Army a bit before his historic ride into Holly Springs, but that didn't seem to bother him, and they gave him a unit to lead. So that's Van Dorn. Anyway, the raid that he concocted, or his general, probably Chalmers, his superiors, concocted this flanking movement. It started off down in Grenada or somewhere thereabouts, and went east to around Columbus. Then it went north. He spent some time in Tupelo area. Tupelo wasn't much of a town then. And the Union's intelligence was that he was going to go from there on to north to Grand Junction or to somewhere in Tennessee where there was a lot of fighting going on. Nathan Bedford's Forrest was up there, and he was holding the Union troops at bay and actually keeping them out of Memphis at that time. But he took a hard a left turn and headed towards Holly Springs. Was the gathering point. Railroads crossed there, gathering point for troops and supplies, and that was his base. However, he chose to be down here in Oxford for perhaps reasons that everybody migrates to Oxford, but he was down here about a month. And he conducted troop movements during that time. In fact, he sent a group of troops out that actually trailed Van Dorn and was aware of his presence. And well, they weren't at the first, but they became aware of his presence, and they sent messages back to Grant that there were troops moving north, and the possibility they might be coming to Holly Springs. That the officer in charge there learned that, and he sent out two messages. Of course, that being the way you communicate, two of them, and they got lost in the Yocney Bottom. That's the story. That was easy to do. It's easy to do today. But it was really dense then. It never got to Oxford, and so Grant never got the message in time. Later he did. But at any rate, on the morning of December 20th, early in the day, Van Dorn raided Holly Springs. There's a bit about Holly Springs that can be seen dimly, but they had the depot. They actually had two depots because two distinct railroads crossed there, and it was a town much more prominent than Oxford. They had better land for agriculture and a lot of things better than Oxford at that time. So here comes the gist of our story. And I want to read a bit about these two sources. The first one I want to read is a part of John Cullen's book. John Cullen was a local contractor and a friend of Fulton in a sense. Actually, Cullen's father was a hunting companion and a confidant, I guess you'd call him, of Fulton. Fulton used a lot of his stories, hunting stories, in his books. But here's what Fulton said in one sense. Now, he changes Wohlleben to be a Union deserter, but at any rate, here he goes. A German, this is from Requiem for a Nun by Fulton. He describes a German private, a blacksmith, a deserter from a Pennsylvania regiment, who appeared in the summer of '64 riding a mule, or so it was later told, when his family of daughters became matriarchs and grandmothers of the town's new aristocracy. For a saddle blanket, chief of virgin and uncut United States banknotes. This is an old story. Now, this is John Cullen's story, jumping in here. The German was old Bully Wohlleben, we pronounce it Wohlleben, who was with Forrest Regiment. Well, that's not true. This unit was one that perhaps it rode with Forrest at some time, but they were reassigned to a lot of different units, Georgia, Tennessee. Wohlleben himself was wounded in Atlanta. All right, Cullen says this is an old story. Wohlleben was with Forrest Regiment. They captured a federal payroll somewhere between here and Memphis, and an old bully made saddle blankets out of the uncut bills. He brought 3 horse loads of those federal banknotes home. He said nothing, quietly ran his blacksmith shop, bought a lot of land in Texas and a lot of land in Oklahoma. In Texas, he owned more land than a man could ride across in a day in any direction. Then, when his daughters married, he set them up, set all of his sons-in-law up in business. When he was an old man, he still ran his blacksmith shop. And here's a story that's apocryphal, probably. One of his daughters owned a bedspread made of $10 bills, which were never cut apart until a few years ago. When one of old Bully's grandsons died in Oklahoma, his estate was valued at $38 million. Okay, Cullen is probably selling that grandson short. He probably was worth a lot more money for reasons that I hope I can make clear. But also, there's a lot of truth in this also. Although Cullen was given to hyperbole, he did set his sons-in-law up in business. In fact, they owned a business on all 4 sides of the square, or he set them up in business there. And he did make these trips to Oklahoma and Texas, which somebody who really wants to do a scholarly study of this legend could go to the land records out that way and authenticate some of this if they want to. Of course, Oklahoma was Indian Territory, the IT back then, and land records are scanty. But this did happen, and it's ample authority for it. Some of the stories that came out, I want to read from that, product of my friend Richard Burnett's research. And there's one from the commercial appeal. You can't get any more current, local than that. It says from Grenada, which is where their reporter was, I guess. The best authenticated report from Grenada yesterday concerns Grant's army, which was falling back rapidly upon Corinth. It may be that operations of Van Dorn in his rear and fears for his safety has caused Grant to make this movement. We suggest that he may be looking for a movement down the Mobile and Ohio Railroad. That comes from Holly Springs, down the eastern part of the state, and they didn't do that. But another item was freely circulated in military circles that upon occupying Holly Springs, among other captives taken by General Van Dorn was the federal paymaster, having in possession $3 million. We hope this may be true. This obviously is a commercial appeal, was then run by Confederate sympathizers. Here's another story that was a part of a scholarly article by Professor J.G. Dupree, who was the dean of the, in later years, dean of the School of Pedagogy at the University School of Education. He had rode with the 1st Cavalry at this Van Dorn raid and in other places. He's very proud of it. There's a dormitory name for him at the university, and it's fortunate that the contextualizers that came through here didn't know about his background with the Confederate service. He's very proud of it and wrote many articles about their triumphs. But here's what he had to say. He was there, remember. At the time of Van Dorn's raid, in addition to the sutler's surprise stored in Holly Springs, a large amount of money had been brought there by General Grant's paymasters for the purpose of paying off the troops. The money consisted only of treasury notes of the issue of April 1862. All of it fell into the hands of the Confederates, as Confederate money at that time was considered to be valuable. The Confederates amused themselves by lighting their cigars on the federal money with $20 bills and sticking up sheets of this money on the walls and shooting them with their pistols. But there was one member of Van Dorn's men who was wiser than the rest. He rolled up many thousands of these dollars, carried them home to his wife, and at the close of hostilities found himself a very rich man. He doesn't name Wohlleben by name then, but he does in other reports about what a good soldier he was. As I said, Dupree, who left Mississippi and went to the University of Chicago and was first a professor of Latin and Greek on the campus, was very proud of his service in the 1st Mississippi Cavalry in the Civil War. And there are many more stories like that, but I just cite those because it's readable and easy. So I'm telling you about those. Now, here's a picture of Oxford after the Civil War. Actually, it was after, and this happened all in 1862. The town was not burned until '64, right at the end of the war. And so it really doesn't have relevance. In '62, Oxford was still pretty much of a town. I might say about Wohlleben, he was living, and the location is noted in some of the authorities, that he was living in the back of the blacksmith shop. He had several children. And he had a few more born during, he and his wife had more born during the Civil War. So you can suggest that he had a lot of free time, that he came back to Oxford from time to time and got with his family. But in 1870, he started buying land around Oxford. I have lined out a part of it here, but it's impossible to locate it all because it was spotted around. He bought land for non-payment of taxes. He acquired land because he lent money to, this is in a 20-year span, a 30-year, until the year 1900. Lent money to widows. There were a lot of them around in those days. And some of the widows sold him their land in what would be described now as a reverse mortgage. I've seen at least one of the documents that said that this lady was conveying him property, and that he accepted it with the provision that she could buy it back when she was able. Now, I'm not saying that was always the case, but at least in one case it was. So, on the map, which you're perhaps seeing, there is noted that two fine houses on North Lamar, the houses that are now owned by Tom Davis, and that's one of them called Fiddler's Folly, and the other one occupied by Dr. Sweeney and his wife. Now, those were not acquired. I don't think Wohlleben was looking for fine houses, but after he died and all the money rolled in, his daughters bought those houses and lived in them. Wohlleben himself, I think, continued to live in pretty modest circumstances. But when the money came in and he had gone in 1904, I think's the date, then they began to buy things. They bought a house on Madison Avenue, which is a very nice house, and at this time in 2023, it's being restored by the Tosh family. And it had been rental property for a long time. I've been in that house. It's a very unusual house with a full one-story, full basement, full attic, and high ceilings, and it has 3 front doors. Perhaps for each one of his daughters may have lived there. I know his widow lived there. At any rate, that was did not come into possession of the Wohlleben family until after the war. Wohlleben himself lived in a small house down near the cemetery. He also acquired, skipping a bit, when he died, he left a will which, very short and sweet, he divided everything up to his wife for life, and then equally to his 3 children, except for a lot that he left to his manservant, Tom, I've forgotten what it is, but it's you can imagine that it became very valuable property. If you start in at a location which is a bakery in 2023, and go on and continue down to the Bramlett Boulevard and go backwards to where there's a shopping center, not as far as Cheney's drugstore, but almost. And that was his tanning yard, where his manservant apparently operated the man. He left that to him. A very valuable piece of property, and through the years you can see he or his family sold off bits of it, and I hope he got a good price for it all, because it's very valuable. Being a tanning yard, it's amusing to think about what if the EPA came along and tested the soil there, what they might find. You heard me read about John Cullen talking about his sons-in-law, his daughters, and therefore his sons-in-law, owning property on the Oxford Square, all 4 sides, which he did, starting with Nielsen's store. One daughter married J.E. Nielsen, and the present store still operating, I'm glad to say, in 2023, was on the east side of the square. There's another son-in-law, Cobb, or Cobbs. It's hard to put that S on it, but Cobbs owned a dry goods store where the First National Bank is now. Cobb was probably not as aggressive a merchant. He also sold Buicks. He sold clothing, fabrics, I guess what a household of that at that time would want, and Buicks. It was said that he was very thrifty, and then when a customer came in after lighting came in, and this store stayed a store until the 40s. I remember it very well. He would go around and pull a cord to illuminate what the customer wanted to see. Then when the customer moved off, he'd turn off the light. Very thrifty person. Of course, that's a sort of apocryphal story probably people tell about. Now moving on to the west side of the square, he set up one of his daughters, Sultan, one of his sons-in-law who was married, whose name was Sultan. We'll talk about that family in a minute. He had a hardware store in the middle of the square on the west side. On the south side, one of his sons-in-law became president of the Bank of Oxford, which was formed in 1872, and I think Wohlleben had a hand in that. He also was a director of another bank, which is another story, but that son-in-law named Carter was the president of the bank. He was also an attorney. He ended up with the property where the City Grocery restaurant is. Before that, the City Grocery was, and it's still in the Wohlleben hands. And I'll explain that. Now moving on to the east side of the south side, Wohlleben owned all the property from what is now off Square Books property to the corner, rounding the corner, going down past Proud Larry's, going on down to what is now Barbecue Place, then going back to the east to where we saw the tree and the film of his blacksmith shop, and then on up to what avenue? I guess it's Harrison Avenue. Of course it is. Up to Harrison, a lot of property, and that's some of it stayed in the family hands. Parts of it was recovered by a grandson whose name was Jim Kyle Hudson in the 20th century. And unfortunately, he died before he could complete everything he had in mind for the university. He was, for the town, he was a nice man. We'd call on my father and talk about the old times, and maybe that's how I got interested in all of this story. I was sitting there listening to a part of it. Well, all right, that's for his sons-in-law, and I want to point out that I know that Wohlleben was a benevolent person, not only to his family, but to the Presbyterian Church. My father admitted that Wohlleben, my father was very protective of the legend. He didn't want, the Nielsens apparently were very sensitive about being, having wealth as a result of stealing the payroll, but I'll pause here to say, as far as I'm concerned, there was nothing wrong with that. The spoils of war, what would you do with the money? You give it back to the Union? No. Would you give it to the Confederates? They had, somebody had better sense than to do that if they were lighting cigars with it. So why not? Bring it on, it's the spoils of war. Well, Grant is, we'll find out after he lost all his stores in Holly Springs, he adopted the policy of living off the land. And wherever his troops were, they supposedly went 15 miles in each direction and got whatever sustenance they could. And as the legends bear out, they took a lot of personality from the people of Mississippi, and when Sherman went through Georgia the same way. It was just the way wars were conducted, and a lot of fine silver. That's probably the most valuable thing they had, and that is the citizens had, went with the Union troops. At any rate, in 1881, the First Presbyterian Church had started a project, and it stopped for lack of money. And Wohlleben stepped forward, and we don't know how much he paid to finish the job. But even my father, who I started out by saying was very protective of the Wohlleben name, admitted that he did step in there and finish the job. And his children later doubted as stained glass windows. They're very fine windows in the church. This is the one to the parents' Wohlleben. Here's one by Nielsen, given by Nielsen. Here's one given by Cobbs. So